Hello, everyone. My name is Tyrone Hayes. I'm here with Daphne Miller, and we are here as scientists to have a dialogue to discuss the dangers of industrialized agriculture. Daphne.
Hello. Hi, Tyrone. I'm so happy to be speaking with you today. And this is especially exciting for me because I'm a family doctor, but have actually for years been inspired by Tyrone's research in ecology and agriculture. And it really has very much shaped the focus of my career. So I'm looking forward to this conversation.
As am I. Of course, we've met before and had dialogue similar to this before in other venues. And so it's really exciting to be here and also to be a part of this program. It's funny and interesting to me to be referred to as someone who studies agriculture and ecology, because that's certainly not where I started out. It's certainly not where I would have predicted I would be, when I started my career. I like to think of myself as just a little boy who likes frogs, and I got my PhD in biology and studied at Harvard and then at Berkeley here to really study amphibian development, frog development, and got involved in examining the effect of pesticides on amphibians. And that's how I've ended up being known as somebody who's studying agroecology when that really wasn't the field that I got into. Yeah, and yourself, how did you get into your?
I was someone who always wanted to take care of little humans, and actually did my medical internship in Salinas in the middle of a agricultural lettuce basket. And started to see that so many of my patients there were harmed by the agricultural system and exposure to herbicides and pesticides, and also a lot of the inequities that went along with being migrant laborers, and suddenly realized that I wanted to focus on agriculture and how to make it a more health-giving practice rather than one that made people ill, both in terms of the workers, but also the folks in the community that were exposed to all the byproducts of agriculture. So I too had this meandering path to my career, and it really has been focused, at least in large part, on how to change our agricultural system to be one that is health promoting rather than health denying.
There's another point where we overlap because I've also worked in Salinas. I spent a great deal of time there. Primarily once I got involved in studying the impact of pesticides on amphibians. Being in California, Salinas became a place that I looked at because there were, there's a very, well, I don't know if it's famous. It's famous for me, but there's a passage in Steinbeck's work where he talks about Salinas and the millions of frogs that were there, et cetera. And now there are no native frogs in the time that I've worked there in Salinas. There's introduced bullfrogs, but no native frogs. And it's I think clear that the impact of agriculture and the movement of water and the loss of habitats, but also the contamination of water with pesticides in Salinas has contributed to the loss of biodiversity, and especially to those of amphibians.
Well, I actually, some of your, I don't know if they were your earliest papers, but some of your early papers on endocrine disruptors actually coincided with, my training. And I remember reading them and immediately, even though the stories were about frogs, immediately realizing that these were the pesticides that I was seeing applied in the fields. And understanding even then that the hormones that you were talking about were not ones that were unique to frogs at all, but that were these kind of universal keys that worked throughout the animal kingdom. And very early on thought, gee, if it's doing this to frogs, what is it doing to my patients? And, very much with the understanding that it was in the groundwater and that everybody was being exposed to it, at least to some degree. and understanding that these exposures in adulthood were problematic to some degree, but in childhood and especially in fetal development could completely change the path and the destiny of a developing fetus. And that information for me really was absolutely galvanizing in terms of thinking about that this is a problem that I need to begin to address. And how do we make sure that folks are not being exposed to this stuff? And early on, I think that my work very much was more anti-pesticide, and where it's evolved to now is much more trying to build alternative systems that don't even require these pesticides, rather than fighting them one by one. Because I realize that you ban one and another one pops up. And so I'm wondering where you are with all this in terms of how do we, where are the pressure points for making a difference? Because we have enough information to know that these are terribly dangerous for, all living creatures, and that green chemistry and just integrated pest management and alternative systems are the way to go. But I'm wondering where you are with your work with all this these days.
Yeah, back up a little bit to make sure the audience is with us. When we're talking about endocrine disruptors, we're talking about chemicals that interfere with hormones, and hormones, both in frogs and humans, and actually really in all animals, hormones regulate development and sometimes regulate permanent aspects of development and growth. And so when you're introducing chemicals that interfere with those hormones, you can have permanent effects, even sometimes from very short exposures. And the hormones that are present in my frogs are also present and active in humans. They are synthesized in the body and function in the body exactly the same way. And what Daphne is referring to is that when you see problems in frogs, you can predict that similar problems might occur in humans. The other thing that's important is to think about human development, early development, the fetus, as an aquatic organism, because we develop in amniotic fluid in much the same way that my tadpoles are in aqueous solution in water. And we now know that on average, humans are exposed now to over 300 synthetic chemicals before they leave the womb. And most of those, we have no idea what they do. Many of them may be acting as endocrine disruptors. And because they're so broadly applied and because we're so broadly exposed, just like with my frogs, it's almost now hard to tell what's normal. When you look at things like increasing malformation rate and deformities, or increasing disease rates, or increasing autism, or whatever your
or even inflammatory diseases related to obesity and adiposity, like, type 2 diabetes, heart disease, different cancers, even depression.
Yeah, there are many things that I think we're almost now accepting as normal because they're so widespread that and I'm not saying they're all caused by and due to pesticides, but a great many of them are likely. In terms of alternatives, I certainly think that we need to move away from high pesticide use in large-scale agriculture. In many cases, the chemical that I work on, for example, atrazine, in many cases, the use of those chemicals is not about feeding the world. Chemicals like atrazine, the reported increase in corn yield is 1.2%. And the EPA is reporting that something like 46% of all species and 52% of all habitats will be affected by atrazine. And yet they continue to allow the chemical to be used, to allow the chemical to be on the market. So I think that there definitely needs to be a need there needs to be a demand from citizens to have organic or pesticide-free, or at least limited use of pesticides. And one way to do that is by labeling products and making products available so that people can vote with their dollars, but also vote with your votes and look for politicians that are really supporting a safer environment and safer food production.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with all of that. One of the interesting shifts for me recently in my work is that I've taken a faculty position in a family medicine residency training program. So teaching the next generation of physicians, which is a little bit of a different focus than I've had in the past. And what's very exciting about this work is that we're based in North Richmond, which is a community which really has been exposed to an incredible amount of environmental toxicity, both through the Chevron plants that are right there, and a lot of the industrial, the railroads and other industries that are there in North Richmond. And so, very high chemical burden. And what it's really forcing us as a health community there to do is to rethink what is a model for health that really takes these things on and isn't just, treating problems as they arise and kind of putting our thumb in the dike, but really thinking of recreating a healthy community. And one of the big efforts we're involved in is actually local agriculture. And for example, we're working with a farm called Urban Tilth, which is, rebuilding soil, cleaning air, cleaning water through the work that they're doing. And it's gotten me thinking that a lot of these solutions, and obviously there's, at the same time, I don't want to make it sound like just farming is the only solution in Richmond. They're doing health and all policies and lots of political efforts to change industrial land use and so on. But what it has gotten me realizing is how much these solutions need to be local and tailored to communities. And I think the problem right now is that even people who think they're part of the solution a lot of times are trying to come up with these one-size-fits-all approach. And, sadly, even things like soil carbon sequestration, which sounds great on the surface, but, when you start to dig into the science, it doesn't really make a lot of sense. Or genetically modified organisms as a way of producing more food. All of these, consolidation of crops so that we're growing tons of one thing in one place to ship around the world. These solutions don't seem to be working. I, as a result of my new work, have really been thinking about local solutions to health and so on.
I think that's important. Before going, I wanted to correct one thing. So I gave some numbers about atrazine. So the EPA's numbers are that 54% of all species will be affected by atrazine and 40% of all habitats. So I may have given the wrong numbers. I want to make sure and correct that. And that's the EPA's estimate for, and again, atrazine is the number 2 most widely used agrochemical. And they're saying that 54% of all species and 40% of all habitats will be affected. This was just in 2020. And in that same year, they reapproved atrazine. So it goes to show that at least right now, we don't have a government agency that's really acting to protect us. I wanted to comment also, Daphne, for a minute on, you mentioned GMOs, and I think that's a large part of the problem in industrialized agriculture, because when I was in college 30 years ago and people talked about GMOs and talked about things like frost-resistant strawberries and drought-resistant wheat and more nutritious grains, that was one thing. But 90% of GMO is now used to make plants resistant to herbicides. I should also point out, when Daphne and I say pesticides, we mean anything that kills a pest. I know some people think of pesticides as just insecticides, but we're using the term more broadly. That technology, I don't personally have a problem with the technology, with GMO technology, but it's being used to actually make crops, to make agriculture, to make people dependent on chemicals. And it's encouraging the use of chemicals in monoculture. And that's already the case in the US. And I'm even more distressed now as we work internationally and see that more and more quote, developing countries are being encouraged to adapt that same type of agriculture, which is even more disturbing to me because it's creating an even greater global problem.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I was actually quite disturbed by the big Sunday read in the New York Times this past weekend on GMOs, basically listing out all these wonderful benefits of this technology, including, pomegranates and, saving papayas and so on, which is one tiny slice of the story. And what you're saying, Tyrone, is absolutely true, that most of the time it's used as this, coupled technology with herbicides and pesticides to make to basically sell more of those drugs. I call them drugs or pharmaceuticals because they really are made by the same industries. And it would be the equivalent, for humans of, selling, an infection and an antibiotic together,
Yeah.
Sort of how I explain it to folks, and having you take them both at once. It's just, it is a false solution in most instances. And I would love to get the conversation out there more about, ways to do things at scale in communities, but that don't require these technologies. Is this something that you're involved in, Tyrone, in your work?
I'm not involved directly. I'm still more involved in trying to understand the impact of the pesticides directly on amphibians and also as it relates to human health related concerns. But I'm also concerned about the GMO issue, as you mentioned. It's also a runaway problem because the weeds, for example, the targets of the herbicides, weeds become resistant, which means you use more and more weed killer, and which means you require more and more crops that are genetically modified to be resistant to the weed killer, which means we're simultaneously losing diversity in our food crops and also getting weeds that are more and more resistant to the chemicals that we have. So it's a problem that creates itself, and then that's not to mention all of the impact on the non-target organisms, including humans, especially our agricultural workers and people who work in the agricultural industry.
So I work in a community where there are incredibly high rates of chronic disease that in large part one can trace back to both adverse childhood experiences and adverse childhood exposures. When we talk about individuals making healthy choices to change the planet and change the destiny of their own health, I feel like that is an incredibly privileged perspective to have because, in fact, for so many of my patients, there is no choice. I mean, what Tyrone just mentioned, they go to the local grocery store and it's a choice between sodas and Snickers bars. They want to go out for a healthy walk and, you get to choose whether you want to walk along the rail yard or through the Chevron, near the Chevron refinery. So these are things that need to be large scale community transformations, which requires both a change of who's in power and who owns that land and can control that land, and who says, what is permissible and not permissible to do with the environment and with the water and the air in that community. And so a lot of my work right now as a physician, a family doctor, training other family doctors is to show them how they cannot make a very big difference within the four walls of an exam room. As I mentioned before, it really is kind of putting your finger in the dike And what they need to do is venture out of the clinic and start to work on inter-organization partnerships and building policies and giving power to the community to change their environmental and ecological and social health. And that's, I feel, where the real change lies, and not just in people, buying the right thing in the grocery store.
Yes, very much agreed. Thank you, Daphne. This has been a wonderful conversation. I hope our conversation, I hope the broader conversation doesn't end here. I think that we are at a critical time where the world needs to be fed, but there's a much safer way to do it. Thank you for joining me, and thank you for the conversation, and thank you for inviting me.
Thank you.